their children. Trayvon's death last spring caused me to sit down to have a conversation with my own 15-year-old son, like my dad did with me. But as a father who loves his son and who is more knowing in the ways of the world, I had to do this to protect my boy. I am his father, and it is my responsibility to make him aware of the world that he must still confront.
That racism is an important stabilizing function, serves as a stabilizing function in a society that is built on property.
Free.
Slavery is replacing indentured servitude as the labor system of choice, and by the beginning of the 18th century it is clear that through law in the Chesapeake, slavery is being made a racially based institution and people are being considered property.
In 1705, the slave codes were passed. Very important. What the slave codes did was to tell everybody, whites on one side and blacks on one side, how you were to treat black folk and how whites were to behave towards each other. It says that every white person must accept how black folk were to be treated. They must accept the public policy. And that every white institution, every white church, every white business, every white school, every white level of government, and every white individual must treat black folk in an exploited, subordinated, excluded manner. Any white person who deviated from that, he could be hurt and injured and lynched. Even whites could not deviate from that policy. And no white person could raise a black person up to make him equal to a white person.
But unlike Lincoln, the new president, Andrew Johnson, wasn't interested in former slaves. He was a Southerner and a Democrat and had been a slave owner himself. In February 1866, he vetoed an expansion of the Freedmen's Bureau and then looked the other way as Southern leaders instituted new black codes that restricted the freedom of black people. At the same time, he called for the welcoming of white Southern leaders back into the national government.
This is a country for white men. And by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men. I cannot take the position that a state which attempted to secede is out of the Union. I shall be in favor of the states resuming their former relations to the government in all respects.
President Andrew Johnson basically gave the white South a free hand in organizing new government. Didn't give blacks any rights and said, okay, Southern whites can form new governments. And these new governments passed these black codes to regulate the freedom of the former slaves. And basically, they tried to put them in a condition as close to slavery as possible, using the law to force blacks to go back to work on the plantations. They didn't have civil rights. They couldn't go to court. They couldn't testify. They couldn't vote. The black codes try to make the status of the former slaves that of dependent plantation laborers under the control of the white population.
But then this terrible shadow began to fall back across black life in America that effectively re-enslaved enormous numbers of people. And what that was all about, what that was rooted in, was that the Southern economy, and in a way the American economy, was addicted to slavery, was addicted to forced labor, and the South could not resurrect itself. And so there was this incredible economic imperative to bring back coerced labor, and they did on a huge scale.
You say they did it by criminalizing black life.
Well, and that was a charade, you know. But the way that happened was that, of course, before the Civil War, there were slave codes, there were laws that governed the behavior of slaves, and that was the basis of laws, for instance, that made it where a slave had to have a written pass to leave their plantation and go and travel on an open road. Well, immediately after the Civil War, all the Southern states adopted a new set of laws that were then called black codes, and they essentially attempted to recreate the slave codes. Well, that was such an obvious effort to recreate slavery that the Union military leadership that was still in the South overruled all of that. Still, that didn't work. And by the time you get to the end of Reconstruction, all the Southern legislatures have gone back and pass laws that aren't called black codes, but essentially criminalize a whole array of activities that it was impossible for a poor black farmer to avoid encountering in some way.
Such as?
Vagrancy. So vagrancy was a law that essentially, it simply, you were breaking the law if you couldn't prove at any given moment that you were employed. Well, in a world in which there were no pay stubs, it was impossible to prove you were employed. The only way you could prove employment was if some man who owned land would vouch for you and say he works for me. And of course, none of these laws said it only applies to black people, but overwhelmingly, they were only enforced against black people. And many, many times, thousands of times, I believe, you had young black men who attempted to do that. They ended up being arrested and returned to the original farmer where they worked in chains, not even as a free worker, but as a slave.
And the result, as you write, thousands of black men were arrested, charged with whatever, jailed, and then sold to plantations, railroads, mills, lumber camps, and factories in the Deep South. And this went on, you say, right up to World War II.